All right, let's get right into it. We're diving into a really complex legal and political saga that's all about New York's Attorney General Letitia James. It's a story packed with indictments, stunning dismissals, and some very serious accusations. From the very beginning, Letitia James has been absolutely clear about where she stands. She says the charges are baseless. End of story. But that defiant statement immediately makes you wonder.
Right, that's the big question here, isn't it? Not once, but two different attempts to bring criminal charges against a sitting attorney general. So to really get what's going on, we need to break down how we got here and what it all means. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the latest big news, that grand jury decision. Then we'll rewind to see why the first case failed. After that, we'll get into the explosive politics of it all, see who else is involved, and then try to figure out what happens now.
Okay, let's kick things off with the event that really blew this story wide open again. A very surprising decision from a grand jury. So this was the DOJ's second shot. Prosecutors went in, they laid out their evidence, but the group of citizens who heard it all, well, they decided there just wasn't enough there to bring criminal charges. And what makes this so interesting is how incredibly rare this is.
You know, the Washington Post called this an unusual event, pointing out that grand juries almost always go along with what the prosecutor wants. So for them to say no here, that's a really big deal, and it definitely raises some eyebrows about the case itself.
And just so we're all on the same page, a grand jury isn't what you see on TV deciding guilt or innocence. Their job is done in secret, and it's much simpler. They just decide if there's enough evidence, what's called probable cause, to even formally accuse someone of a crime. In this case, their answer was a clear no.
But here's the thing, this wasn't the first time the prosecution hit a major wall. To get the full picture, we got to rewind the clock a little bit. This timeline really lays it all out. See, the DOJ did get an indictment back on October 9th. They were successful. But then, just a little over a month later, a federal judge threw the whole case out. And that is what led them to try again with the second grand jury, which we now know also failed. So why did that first case get tossed? This part is crucial. It wasn't about the evidence. The judge threw it out on a legal technicality. She ruled that the prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, was unlawfully appointed. Basically, she didn't have the proper authority to bring the case, so everything she did was invalid. And to add another layer to it all, it was reported she had zero previous experience as a prosecutor.
Okay, so this is where the story shifts from legal procedures to straight-up politics. You really can't understand any of this without looking at the bigger picture and the history between Letitia James and the Trump administration.
And you have to remember this number, $355 million. That's the amount of the massive civil fraud judgment that Letitia James, as New York's AG, won against Donald Trump. Now, that specific penalty was later voided by an appeals court, but that huge win cemented her as a major political and legal opponent, and her supporters say it gave her enemies a powerful reason to retaliate.
So after all this went down, James came out swinging. She flat out called this a politically motivated attack, saying the justice system was being used as a weapon to go after a political rival.
But of course, that's not the only side to this story. Bill Pulte, he's the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the FHFA, and he's the one who made the criminal referrals in the first place. He completely denies any political motivation. He says his agency is just fighting mortgage fraud, and it doesn't matter who you are or what party you're in.
And it's important to realize this isn't just a two-person fight. The conflict has actually gotten a lot bigger, pulling in other well-known names and even sparking brand new federal investigations. So, Director Pulte's agency didn't just go after Letitia James. He's made criminal referrals against 4 different prominent Democrats. And one of them, Congressman Eric Swalwell, has fired back with his own lawsuit against Pulte.
And Swalwell's lawsuit is pulling no punches. It's making some really serious claims. It says Pulte and the FHFA misused their power, illegally got their hands on private mortgage records, and in doing so, violated the Federal Privacy Act. And this has now kicked things up another notch. The Government Accountability Office, which is basically the investigative arm of Congress, has launched its own official investigation into the FHFA to see if federal authority was in fact being misused here.
Okay, so after all that, a dismissed case, a grand jury saying no, where do we even go from here? Well, this fight is definitely not over yet. Well, the DOJ isn't completely out of moves. For one, they can appeal the judge's ruling that threw out that first case. Or They could roll the dice a third time and try to get an indictment from a completely different grand jury.
So in the end, it really boils down to two completely different stories, doesn't it? On one side, you have Letitia James saying this is a baseless political hit job. On the other, you have Bill Pulte insisting this is just a legitimate, nonpartisan crackdown on fraud. Both sides are sticking to their guns.
And that leaves us with the million-dollar question at the very heart of all this. Where do you draw the line? When does tough law enforcement cross over and become political targeting? The answer to that is probably going to be decided not just in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion.